Alright, we'll continue our discussion of sex ratios. That sex ratio, again, is usually 1-to-1 in most organisms. One way that this can be maintained is through frequency-dependent selection. So what this means is, if there's a situation where there's a lot of males in the population, then females become more evolutionarily desirable, because that means that there will be a better chance of those females contributing to the next generation. And so if there are a lot of males, the selection will be for more females. If there are a lot of females, the selection could be for more males. Now, there are situations where there can be a skewed sex ratio. So one example of this has to do with the fig wasps. If you haven't watched the documentary yet about the fig tree, I highly recommend watching it soon. It's really good, and that'll make this fig wasp discussion here make a little more sense. So let's imagine that you're a female fig wasp, and you make it into that fig, and you're the only one that makes it into the fig. Right? In that situation, it would make sense for that female fig wasp to produce a lot more daughters than sons. The reason being, the more daughters she produces, the more offspring that she has. Right? If she produces, let's say, 8 offspring, and if it were a 1-to-1 ratio, there were 4 daughters and 4 sons, well, she'd have 4 daughters producing offspring. If there were, let's say, 7 daughters, well, she has 7 daughters producing offspring. Right? That single male could fertilize all the females. And so if she's alone, it makes a lot more sense to have more daughters than sons. However, if she isn't alone, if she gets inside that fig and there are other females present, well, then we're going to have an increase in the number of sons, because the more sons there are, then the more chance they have of fertilizing females from those other fig wasps that have made it in there. Right? So my point here is that sex ratios can very much be context specific, that it's going to matter what's going on around them, that they can be changed based on current conditions. And in some species like the fig wasps, we probably expect there to often be a skewed sex ratio. Alright, so the next thing I want to talk about then is mating systems. And what we're going to see here is that the different mating systems that organisms use are going to be largely influenced by the differences in gametes. And here's what I mean by that. Sperm are relatively small and relatively cheap. It's easy to produce a lot of them without much investment. Eggs are more limited. They're larger and require more of an investment. Those differences in gametes are going to have important consequences for the mating systems of organisms. If we think about a female, again, based on those differences in gametes, a female's reproduction is going to be focused on the number of eggs that she produces and the quality of the mate that she has. Right? She has a limited number of eggs, and so her reproductive output is going to depend a lot on finding the highest quality mate she can to fertilize those eggs. On the other hand, since sperm are relatively small and cheap and males tend to produce a lot of them, male reproductive output is often going to be influenced primarily by how many females they can mate with. Alright, so we're going to be thinking about these sort of different approaches to reproduction based on the differences in gametes, and how that plays out in various social systems set up to maximize reproduction for the species involved. Alright, so let's start out here with our first social system. We're going to be looking at, we've got the sunflowers on the far right there. And sunflowers practice promiscuity. There are no social bonds that form among sunflowers. They are a good example of this. It also turns out that most animals are promiscuous. So what we're going to see is that most animals and outcrossing plants like those sunflowers are not really bonding or choosing which other individuals to mate with, that it's more just kind of random, right? That if you think about those sunflowers, for example, they produce pollen, they release the pollen out into the air, the pollen floats around and happens to land on another sunflower, right? No social bonds are forming, no choosing is being done. It's just sort of a random reproduction. Now, keep in mind, just because it's random doesn't mean that there can't be more success, right? That genes can't be better and some individuals will survive and reproduce better than others. But there's no choosing going on. There's no mate selection taking place. All right, other sorts of social systems we're going to look at. We're going to start with polygamy. Polygamy is any time that you have a single individual mating with other individuals, multiple other individuals. We're going to start with polygyny. In polygyny, such as our elk that we have as our example here, in polygyny, social bonds are formed, right? So there's some choosing that's going on. There's some connection being made between the individuals that are going to be the parents. In polygyny, that social connection occurs between one male and more than one female. So for our example here, we have those elk. We have a single bull elk over there with a bunch of cow elk. The example here then means that that single male elk is going to have offspring then with those female elk. This often happens when males compete with each other or if males defend a specific area. And so that bull elk may have fought with other bull elk and have won in order to have access to these females. Or maybe they'll defend in a specific area. Maybe there will be a specific territory that they defend, and then females will choose which males to mate with based on which territory they want to be in. Let's look at an example of this. I had an opportunity to experience a species that practices polygamy. I was able to work for about 2 months on the Farallon Islands, which are off the coast of California. If you go to San Francisco, go about 25 miles straight west down to the Pacific, you'll find the Farallon Islands. We were close enough you could actually see the Golden Gate Bridge on clear days. Out here on the Farallon Islands, there is a colony of northern elephant seals. And those northern elephant seals are polygynous. This group that we see here is made up primarily of females. And these females are going to all mate with a male who is going to be the one that sort of controls that, what's called a harem. And so that male is going to fight with other males, is going to defend that harem, is going to keep a watch over them basically 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so that no other males have access to those females. That single male is going to be the father of the offspring produced by all those females. In the colony that I worked at, there were around 60 to 70 females that were there. And so that bull elephant seal is going to be the one that is going to be the parent, the male parent of all the offspring from that year. All the other males are not getting to reproduce, only the males that are able to have a harem like that and defend it. This requires a huge amount of effort. I'll just mention that the bull elephant seal that was in charge of the harem when I was there, he lost a huge amount of weight over the time that I worked. Probably at the beginning of the breeding season, he was probably around, 4,000 pounds, and by the time the breeding season was over, he was maybe a couple thousand pounds. I mean, he probably lost about half of his weight because it required such an effort to defend those females. But the evolutionary reward is, right, he was able to have lots of offspring, whereas the males who didn't have a harem, unsuccessful. Another type of polygamy, then, is polyandry. In polyandry, we have the formation of social bonds, but in this case, we have a single female mates with more than one male. So a polyandrous organism, our example here are these toads, that female is going to produce, in this case of a toad, they're going to produce many eggs, hundreds or thousands of eggs. And those eggs might be fathered. The father of the offspring from those eggs might be multiple different males. One of the big benefits here is that if a female mates with lots of different males, there's a better chance that she's going to get a higher quality male, right? That by mating with multiple males, she has that variation that some of those offspring are going to have a parent that maybe is better. is higher quality, is more likely to have offspring that survive and reproduce, right? And so the chances of getting that best male go up if you mate with more than one male. Additionally, there are also sometimes some material benefits to polyandry, situations where the female actually gets something out of this. So one example is that some species produce something called a spermatophore. Here I have a picture of an example of a spermatophore. And it's this kind of highly nutritious packet of material that the male is producing that the female is going to take and then consume. And so the more males she mates with, the more spermatophores, sometimes referred to as a nuptial gift, that she's going to get. And so by consuming more spermatophores, she has more energy to devote to reproduction. And so polyandry is beneficial here because she's able to devote more to her reproduction after getting more of those gifts from more males. All right, monogamy would be the mating system that involves social bonds between a single female and a single male. With monogamy, we sometimes have this being a permanent long-term relationship where they'll mate for life. Sometimes it's serial monogamy where they'll be together for one breeding season and then find a different mate perhaps for the next breeding season. But at any one time, they're only mating with a single individual. Now, there's sort of our example here are sandhill cranes, which is a type of large bird. We have some here in Ohio. And that's a pretty good example because in birds, 90% of bird species are monogamous. So most bird species, not all, there are some significant exceptions, but most bird species are monogamous. Whereas, interestingly, in mammals, it's only about 10%. So let's think for a second, why would we have this big difference between birds and mammals in their levels of monogamy? Why would it be more beneficial for a bird to be monogamous than for a mammal? Well, to answer that, we should be thinking here about the differences in how they reproduce. Birds lay eggs. The vast majority of mammals don't. Mammals are able to produce milk to feed their offspring. Birds do not. So if we think about the difference here, during that gestation period, right, the period where the offspring is developing inside the female, a male mammal doesn't have much help to give, right? The offspring is developing inside the mother of the mammal, and the male, not doing that much. In birds, however, once the eggs are laid, well, anybody can incubate, right? And there's a lot of bird species where both the male and the female incubate that they can take turns. The male can be helpful. Also, if you think about what's going on in the mammals, I mentioned this process of milk production, of lactation, that for most mammals, the early part of the life is using milk in order to feed the offspring, and male mammals don't lactate. So again, the females are able to produce food for the offspring, and the males aren't able to do too much. So in other words, if we think about a mammal versus a bird, a male bird is able to help a lot more than a male mammal during the process of raising the offspring. The exception to that can be something like in humans, where we have a very, 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 very long developmental period, right? Where we have human offspring are going to be around for like decades as their parents take care of them. That provides a lot of opportunity for the males then to provide help, and it makes more sense than to have a longer term pair bond where they stay together. In the case of most mammals, however, since the male's only real contribution to the offspring is genetic material, from the male's standpoint, it makes much more sense to go reproduce with many other females as opposed to stay around and not do much. By not do much, I don't mean be lazy. I mean not do much in the sense that not be able to do much that would actually help the offspring have an increased chance of reproduction. From a fitness standpoint, it makes a lot more sense for that male to try to father as many offspring as possible as opposed to help out, which isn't really all that much help. Now, we have to speak a little bit more about monogamy, because there have been some interesting studies that have found that process of monogamy is not always extremely high fidelity, and that there are often what we would call extra pair copulations that take place. And so by an extra pair copulation, I mean, let's say that the male that was associated with the nest of this bird, well, maybe that male had the opportunity to mate with a female from this nest over here, and he does so. That would be an extra pair copulation. Or the female, right, is here, and her male has gone out to get food, and there's another male around, and she has the opportunity to mate with that other male. When we've gotten better technology to be able to keep better track of the parents of offspring, so in other words, being able to do things like paternity tests, what we found is that in species that are socially monogamous, we're talking about birds here specifically, 90% of socially monogamous birds engage in extra pair copulations. In other words, the vast majority of birds are committing what we would refer to in humans as adultery. Now, the question becomes, well, why? Why is this so common? All right, well, let's think about the males first. In the males, it's an easier question to answer, speaking for their fitness. In males, the more females they mate with, the more offspring they produce. Right? So if they have the opportunity to have offspring with a female that they're not bonded to, but then she and the male that she is bonded to are going to raise those offspring, well, that is, from a fitness standpoint, a winning situation for the male. What about the female? Females don't have the same thing, right? Females are only going to have so many offspring. The number of eggs that they can produce, well, that's going to determine their fitness. And so if you think from the female, you think, well, she's got this male that she's bonded with. She's only going to have, let's say she's going to lay 4 eggs this year. She's not going to lay any more eggs if she mates with another male. What would be the benefit? Well, the benefit here is that chance for variation, right? If we think about this, if we look out at all the males that are present in this colony, there's one who's the best. There's one who's the highest quality male. But only one female gets to pair bond with him, right? Only one female is going to share a nest with him. All the rest of the females are going to have to settle for somebody who's not as good. However, if those females then engage in extra pair copulation, they might have that chance of getting a higher quality male to be the parent of their offspring, despite the fact that they're bonded with a male that is maybe not as good. We can actually see some evidence for this in some studies that have been done. This is a bird called a blue throat. And in the case of the blue throats, they did a study, and specifically they did a study looking at immune response. So immune response is obviously going to be important for fitness, to be able to survive things like infection. And here's what they found. They found that the immune response, represented on the y-axis here, of the offspring was higher when the female engaged in an extra pair copulation, when the offspring were fathered by a male that she wasn't bonded to. In other words, there was a benefit to the female to mate with males that were not the one that she was socially connected to. That she got higher quality offspring by doing so. Now, obviously, that means that there's going to be this downside for a male that is bonded to a female and ends up raising offspring that are not his own. Because of that, mate guarding behavior has evolved in many species where the males are reticent to leave the immediate area of the female because they don't want another male coming in and fathering offspring that male who is bonded with her will then end up raising. And so they may hang around the area more, keep a closer eye on them, change their behavior in order to make sure that it doesn't happen. This is even more extreme in some species. So in some species of spiders, for example, when a male mates with a female, the reproductive structure of the male actually breaks off inside the female. so that she will not have any other opportunities to mate with other males, to ensure that he is going to be the father of all the offspring that female produces. That's a pretty extreme example, but it is an example of trying to maintain fitness by making sure that that male is the parent of those offspring. Alright, so let's talk about sexual selection then. In sexual selection, individuals choose which other individuals to mate with. And there are going to be some consequences for that. One of which is that in species that have a lot of sexual selection, we often see the development of sexual dimorphism. What's the root word morph mean? Form or shape. It does not mean change. Form or shape. So sexual dimorphism just means there are just differences between the sexes. Now, those can be, of course, primary sexual characteristics, like genitalia, but we're going to talk about secondary sexual characteristics in a little more detail here because of the large effects that sexual selection has on those characteristics. So, one example of an effect on a secondary sexual characteristic has to do with size. In this picture, we see the female spider on the left and the male spider on the right. Females are larger. One reason might be that they have more of an investment to put in because they have to produce eggs, which are larger and require more material investment. The female also might have to be the one fighting off potential predators that are trying to eat the baby spiders or the spider eggs. And so the selection here is for larger size in order to maximize reproductive fitness. We also often see secondary sexual characteristics in the form of weaponry. So these bighorn sheep, for example, we have a good example of the female on the left and the male on the right there. And the males are competing with each other in order to gain access to females. And so the males have evolved larger horns for these intrasexual contests where they're fighting with each other over access to the females. There's also differences in secondary sexual characteristics driven by female choice. Here's going to be an example of this. This is this kind of crazy bird. If we look at this bird and if we just ignore the tail, this looks a lot like a red-winged blackbird. But if we add the tail, it doesn't look like a red-winged blackbird anymore. This is a bird called a long-tailed widow bird. It's not found here in North America. It's found in Africa. And we take a look at that ridiculously long tail, right? And we look at that and we say, wow, that tail is kind of crazy. Why do they have such a long tail? And the answer seems to be, well, the females prefer it. In fact, someone did a study where they changed the tail length of widow birds. And so they took the males and they either shortened the tails, lengthened the tails, or kept the tails the same length. Probably what they did was, for the tails that were shortened, they took the extra length and then attached it to other males. For the control, they probably went ahead and cut their tails off, but then reattached them. And here's what they found. They found that the males with the longest tails ended up being the fathers of a greater number of nests than the males with the control tail or even the shorter tail. Now, here's my question. If longer tails are better, why didn't the natural selection process of the females choosing males with the longest tails, why didn't it create longer and longer and longer and longer and longer tails in those widow birds? Why is the average length not the most reproductively successful? I don't think there's much of a cost of having a real long tail. Feather material is not that expensive. It's not that heavy. I don't think there's a big detriment to having a really, really, really long tail. So why haven't widow birds developed really, really, really long tails and not just really, really, really long tails? Well, I think the best answer is, in order to have selection, you have to have variation. And so if there's no more genetic variation for tail length, well then, that's as long as the tail could be. We can lengthen it artificially, but barring a mutation that codes for even a longer tail, maybe they've reached their genetic limit for the tail length. All right, so I want to think about then this process of female choice having a big effect on secondary sexual characteristics. And there's a couple of explanations for why this happens, for why a female looks at a male widow bird and prefers one with a longer tail. One reason may be what we call the good genes hypothesis, that says that secondary sexual characteristic correlates with high quality genetics, and that seeing that characteristic tells the female something about the genetic quality of that male. A related idea is something called the good health hypothesis, which says that if that male is able to maintain this really impressive secondary sexual characteristic, he must be pretty healthy. Maybe it must be able to get enough food, have a good immune system, and that choosing those males with the most extreme secondary sexual characteristics is going to give the female a male that can help because he has good health and will pass on genes for good health and good other things to the offspring. Now, when we look at that sexual selection taking place, we also have to acknowledge that at some point, those secondary sexual characteristics can seem pretty dangerous, pretty detrimental. That they're so extreme that they are going to make it less likely, perhaps, for example, this male tragopan to survive. I mean, look at that ridiculous thing, right? He's got this huge blue thing on the front of his face, and it seems like it's really likely to attract things like predators. Well, to a female, though, maybe that says, hey, that male's really been able to put a lot into it. He's been able to invest a lot into that characteristic. Not only has he been able to stay alive, but he's had a lot of energy and material left over to invest in this ridiculous characteristic. And he's been able to survive even though he's made himself much, 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 much less efficient, much more likely to be killed or to die. And yet, here he is, still alive. Now, that sort of reasoning behind these relatively extreme secondary sexual characteristics can result in selection for more and more and more and more and more extreme. That the more extreme they are, the more impressive they must be to the female, because they tell her more and indicate more about the quality of that male. In some species, like a tragopan in our picture here, we could have runaway sexual selection, right? Where selection just keeps getting selected more and more and more and more and more, and the characteristics keep getting more and more and more and more extreme. An example of that, this is an extinct species, but this is the Irish elk. I mean, look at that ridiculous thing. Right? I mean, it's got the antlers that are just huge, ridiculous. I mean, unbelievable, spectacular antlers, but almost just crazy huge. Runaway sexual selection. If larger antlers are more likely to result in offspring next generation, well, then the antlers get larger and larger and larger and larger. Why would it ever stop, though? Well, if we go back to our widow bird, right, we could say, well, at some point, we're going to run out of genetic variation. There's only so much genetic variation available, and so while selection is for larger antlers or a longer tail or whatever it might be, at some point, you just don't have any more variation to select for. And additionally, at some point, well, it just becomes so detrimental. I mean, imagine if females chose males that exploded, right? I mean, exploding, you can't survive to be able to try to reproduce. And so even though the females might select for it, it's not going to end up being a common thing in a population because the cost is too high, right? At some point, the peacock's tail becomes so long that they can't survive anymore. There needs to be some sort of balance between natural selection and sexual selection. So characteristics can become more and more extreme until it's either so costly that it's not worth it, or they run out of genetic variation for it. All right, last thing I wanted to talk about in this chapter is the fact that some of these mating systems that we've talked about and some of these different things like skewed sex ratios maybe are not always all about what's going on with the species that we're discussing. that sometimes there can be some microbial manipulations. So specifically here, we're going to mention a species of bacterium called Wolbachia. And Wolbachia is going to infect invertebrates, especially things like insects. And Wolbachia has this sort of interesting life history where it's only passed down through infected eggs. So only the individuals of the invertebrates that it infects who produce eggs are going to be beneficial for Wolbachia. What that means is that as far as this infection is concerned, the males of the species they infect are useless because males don't produce eggs, they produce sperm. That means that Wolbachia is really in favor of more female offspring being produced. They actually have consequences then for the reproduction of their hosts to maximize the chances of females being produced. One way they do this is they actually alter the sperm. So they change sperm to increase the chance of female offspring being produced. They may encourage species to go through parthenogenesis, right? This is where females just clone themselves. Females copying the cells produce more females to produce more females to produce more females. In some species they found if they're able to remove the Wolbachia infection, then that parthenogenesis stops. In some species they actually directly just convert males into females. And some they're even more direct and they just kill males. So my point here is that Wolbachia has a really big effect on the species that it infects. And that the mating system of those that are infected get drastically changed. That's very beneficial to the bacterium, to the Wolbachia, but not necessarily is helping the host and may actually be harming it. So I guess my point is, if we look at a species and we were trying to reason our way through, well, why in the world would this species be, let's say, carrying out parthenogenesis? Right? There are males around. Variation might be beneficial. Why is parthenogenesis happening? We look at the life history of that species. We look at the natural history of that species. We try to figure out everything we can about it, and we say we just can't figure out why they're going through parthenogenesis. The answer might be, well, maybe it's not about them, right? Maybe that is coming from this infection, this manipulation by a microbe who's doing it for their own benefit, and it has nothing to do with the life history of this species. It's all about this infection they're experiencing. Just something to consider. In ecology, we have to think about all of the interactions, and some of them are not always going to be obvious.